Hey everybody, we're talking about contradictions in the Gospels. And of course we have to talk about Bart Ehrman, the skeptic's hero, who loves to shake things up when it comes to the New Testament. He boldly claims that the Gospels are a world of contradictions and not nearly as helpful for understanding the historical Jesus as we'd like them to be. While some contradictions in the Gospels are tough to explain, and we'll talk about those in future videos, they don't justify Ehrman's extreme conclusions. So how does he build this world of contradictions idea? Simple. He creates contradictions where there aren't any. Be sure to check out my playlist for a full breakdown of his tactics to this point. Now, one of Ehrman's tricks is to take advantage of his audience's lack of knowledge. When experts disagree about a text, he often picks the most anti-Christian interpretation and presents it as the only valid one. He conveniently leaves out the fact that many scholars strongly disagree. So for example, Bart dives into Mark's gospel and declares an apparent contradiction. He says, one point in particular seems to be irreconcilable. In Mark's account, the women are instructed to tell the disciples to go meet Jesus in Galilee, but out of fear, they don't say a word to anyone about it. Then he cites Mark 16 as evidence. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The supposed problem here is that the other three Gospels depict the women informing the disciples. Bart aims to manufacture a contradiction by claiming Mark asserts that they never spoke to anyone. But is this really the right reading of Mark? Nearly all scholars agree that the long ending of Mark wasn't originally part of the text. However, disagreement exists among scholars on whether verse 8 was where Mark really intended to end, as Ehrman believes, or whether the narrative was simply interrupted, left unfinished, or with the conclusion now lost, as Ehrman's own mentor, Bruce Metzger, believed. They even co-authored a book together, The Text of the New Testament. In it, on pages 325 through 326, Metzger questions whether Mark intended to end his gospel with the women's fear. He writes, despite the arguments which several modern scholars have urged in support of such a view, the present writer cannot believe that the note of fear would have been regarded as an appropriate conclusion to an account of the evangel or good news. Metzger further points out that the stylistic weirdness of ending a Greek sentence with the word gar, a rarity in Greek literature and unheard of as the final word of the book. Now get this is the fourth edition of the book, with the same text appearing in the previous three editions, solely authored by Metzger. However, Ehrman was added as a co-author in the fourth edition, so he has to be clearly aware of this. So why does he leave out these inconvenient facts? Ehrman has been peddling this misleading claim since Jesus Interrupted came out nearly 2 decades ago, and he continues to do so, always leaving his audience in the dark. Now, let's revisit Mark 16:8. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. How might Mark have continued if, as Metzger and others believe, the text was interrupted here? In Mark's gospel, we do see a pattern of silence that's never meant to last. Jesus tells people to keep quiet, but the truth always comes out. For instance, a healed leper is told to say nothing to any man, but it ends up being shouted from the housetops. When Jairus' daughter is raised from the dead, Jesus tells him to keep quiet, but the witnesses can't help but to spill the beans. Later, while in the Tyre area, Jesus tries to keep a low profile, but word of his arrival spreads like wildfire. And even later, when Peter, James, and John are sworn to secrecy about the transfiguration, it's implied that the other disciples eventually find out. New Testament expert Robert H. Stein also argues that Mark wouldn't end his gospel with the women's silence. It would leave prophecies unfulfilled about his appearances and take the focus off of Jesus, which goes against the gospel's emphasis on Christ. It's for these reasons, and plenty more, that lots of scholars think that Mark 16:8 represents a spot where the narrative was interrupted, never completed, or lost. However, Ehrman wants to leave his readers with the impression that Mark contradicts Matthew and keeps things one-sided. And this isn't a one-off thing. Ehrman often takes advantage of his readers' lack of knowledge. On pages 39 through 40, Ehrman claims that what the voice at Jesus' baptism said depends on which gospel you read. He writes, in Matthew it says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The voice appears to be speaking to the people around Jesus, or possibly to John the Baptist, informing them who Jesus is. In Mark, however, the voice says, "You are my Son, in whom I am well pleased." In this case, the voice appears to be speaking directly to Jesus, telling him or confirming to him who he really is. In Luke, we have something different. This is a bit complicated because different manuscripts of Luke's gospel give the voice different words. I am talking here about the original wording of the verse as found in some older manuscripts of the Bible, even though it is not found in most English translations. Here the voice says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," quoting the words of Psalm 2:7. But here's what Ehrman doesn't tell his readers. The reading, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," in Luke, quoting Psalm 2:7, is only found in a single Greek manuscript. Sure, it pops up in several Latin manuscripts and in quotations by church fathers, but most textual scholars argue that this was not the original reading. For example, Metzger again corrects Ehrman here, saying, "The Western reading, 'This day I have begotten thee,' which was widely current during the first 3 centuries, appears to be secondary, derived from Psalm 2:7. So why exactly does Ehrman choose the most problematic reading and present it as though it's just as valid as the others? It's another case of cherry-picking evidence to create the illusion of inconsistency. It's a bit shady that Ehrman, who studied under Metzger and even wrote books with him, would give his readers such a one-sided story. He clearly knows better, but he seems to be more interested in pushing his own agenda than being fair. So the lesson here is, don't just take Ehrman's word for it. Check out the other side of the story too. Be a good detective. Look at all the evidence before you make up your mind. Invest in some good commentaries and other scholarly books. Trust me, a little research into the literature can go a long way in protecting yourself from his biased arguments. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. We're going to continue our series of contradictions in the Gospels in future videos and even look at some tougher examples. So be sure to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and thank you so much for watching.